evening. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to this second public session hosted by the Parliamentary Reform Commission. And I just want to say it is indeed a good pleasure to be with you this evening. I anticipate, and we anticipate, a wonderful interactive session. We have persons who are here with us in the auditorium, and there are also persons who have joined with us online. But I just want to especially welcome Lady Cheltenham, who is here with us. Also, we have the historian Dan Carter, historian Bobby Morris, and Mr. Khalil Kofwalia, who is a member of the Constitutional Reform Commission. I also want to welcome all those who are joining with us on the live stream. I look forward to hearing from you, for those who are here and also those who are online. I also want to especially welcome the members of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. We have Sir Roy Trotman, who is on my left. To my right, Sir Roy is the Deputy Chairman of the Commission. To my right is the Chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Sir Richard Cheltenham. Also, Her Honor Senator Elizabeth Thompson, to the right of the Chair. And to the right of Senator Thompson, Dr. William Chandler, Jr. Also with us is Dr. Richard Ishmael. We also have Miss Maxine McLean, and the clerk of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Mr. Pedro Eastman. Yeah. Also myself, can't forget myself. But I also want to, before I continue, before I answer Roy, just to give some opening remarks. I just want to remind you of some of the terms of reference for the Parliamentary Reform Commission. And we have been constituted to examine, consider, and inquire into the parliamentary system, process and procedures, and all other related laws and matters with a view to making recommendations for the strengthening of Parliament and its functions. Also, after we continue our investigations, inquiries, we are to report in writing. Report in writing after due examination, study, and inquiry, giving the commissioners' opinions and making recommendations and providing for consideration for the reformation of the Parliament of Barbados. And as we inquire, as we study, as we gather the thoughts and the opinions of the people of Barbados, we always have to have in our mind, in the forefront of our minds, that we are doing this because Barbados has entered into a new season, if I may say, of parliamentary republicanism. We are now a parliamentary republic. And what we are doing here, we are asking the public of Barbados, those who are in the diaspora, to give their thoughts and opinions as to how and to what they want the Parliament of Barbados to look like, since we are now a republic. But I want to, at this time, invite Sir Roy Trotman. He is going to give some welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. Chairman of the Commission, fellow commissioners, Honorable Robert Morris, distinguished lecturer, Brother Carter, all other very distinguished persons. My task is a most simple one, handed to me on instructions from the chairman, because foundation boys usually took advantage of younger, smaller foundation boys when they came to school at the beginning. So Sir Richard, using his greater height and his more senior years, just to but decided that we had to be able to express our gratitude to the foundation schools now amalgamated, and that we should get a foundation person to do it. So I, on that basis, have been asked to make preliminary comments. And I would want to invite you to enjoy this beautiful part of the town of Oyston, and to recognize that though it has been a small school over the years, we have been trying ever since to punch beyond our weight. The subject this evening is the first in a series, and we are hoping, as the chairman, Brother Beckles, has said, we are hoping that you will understand, especially if you are a cynic, you will understand that now we are moving towards a different level of nationhood, that there are going to be many changes which the government and the people of Barbados will want to consider and reflect on. So you may feel that all you need to do is to change the Constitution. The view of most of Barbados is that other areas have to undergo change. And the area where we have been given the instructions to have your input into bringing about change is in the area of parliamentary reform. There may be other committees that are called upon and that in fact are performing tasks now about how they may reform themselves, whether they be commissions or just boards or whatever the institutional name may be. Our task is not the one of the Constitution Review Commission, which is to examine the old laws, new laws, and any other instruments to see whether there needs to be a new body of laws to govern Barbados in the future. Ours are varied in nature, but we are still very concerned with how we will make national decisions. And we wouldn't want the public at any stage to feel that commissions are going to be tasked with being overburdened with any one issue, when in fact the public would be better served if the leaders of government were able to assign other people who, in our view, may be just equally talented, assign them the task of trying to create the change in Barbados that will make our post-Republican state stronger than our pre-Republican state. So our view today is to invite you to join with us in to welcoming the idea of this exercise of having parliamentary reform looked at. We will not tell you what you must say. The chairman of the day might have, like other speakers, to suggest that you stay with the topic that you've given. But our aim is to listen carefully where we can to ask appropriate questions. And what we do will guide us to put together what your report will be when you submit that report to us, and before we make a presentation of that report to Her Excellency, the President. So we are not going to be the party that takes up your time. We are going to be the party that seeks to hear from you and to encourage you to think about what, in your view, are the things you do now, whether the way you do those things now are the way that they should still be done. If there are changes to be made, what should those changes be? And what instruments you would propose to bring about those changes, whether it is in the personnel in the parliaments, whether it is in the structure of different institutions, whatever it may be. Our task is to hear you, and we are pleased that you have been able to come now. Those who are listening on multimedia, we are hopeful that you will also be able to get questions to us through the Clerk of Parliament, whom you will get in his official capacity at the Parliament buildings. So, Chair, that is just an opening comment intended to make the public and the public here present recognize that we have a task which we cannot do ourselves, but we have a responsibility which we will try to do, that is to invite you to help Barbados to govern itself in the post-Republican stage of its existence in the way that will serve our children and our children yet unborn better than we were served before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Roy. While Sir Roy was speaking, I recognize the presence of His Honor Senator Reginald Farley, the President of the Senate of Barbados. Thank you, sir. As we move forward in the looking at and listening to the presentations from those who are here, I want to invite Ms. Jacqueline Celeste Carter, who would have shown to us, intimated to us her desire to make a presentation this evening. So I now invite her to the microphone.
Good evening, all. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Can you hear me?
Right. Just come a little bit closer to the microphone. Right. If we could raise the volume on the microphone, please.
Good evening, all, and richest blessings. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. A Republic form of government for Barbados, and I'm reading. The purposes of government: to provide for the defense of Barbados and its people, for the education of its people, to provide for the general health and welfare of its people, to provide and promote an environment conducive to economic growth and development for all Barbadians, regardless of party, religion, or racial identity, to encourage and promote the development of Barbadian businesses. Further, government shall not exercise its power of eminent domain pertaining to lands owned by Barbadians for the benefit of foreign companies and or individuals, unless it can demonstrate it is in the best interest of all Barbadians. In the event the government can establish in a court of competent jurisdiction that the taking of private property is for the benefit of all Barbadians, the government shall pay the owner the reasonable cost of the property prior to its taking. The government is precluded from competing with private businesses, whether foreign or domestic. In the event government engages in a strictly commercial activity that results in economic damage to a Barbadian company, and the damage was foreseeable, the party being aggrieved may request punitive damages from the government. Any Barbadian who has been damaged by the actions and or inaction of government shall have standing to sue the government and the individuals who acted and or failed to act. In all such actions, the party bringing the action against the government shall not be liable to the government for attorney fees and costs, unless the case was without merit. Elections. The president should be elected directly by the electorate and shall not be appointed. The prime minister shall be elected directly by the people. There shall be a deputy prime minister directly elected by the people and shall serve in the absence and or incapacitation of the prime minister. The deputy prime minister shall possess all of the powers, rights, and privileges of the prime minister when serving in that capacity. The position of the Deputy Prime Minister cannot be changed as a result of a cabinet reshuffle or by appointment by the Prime Minister, but can only be changed at the time of election or re-election. The Senate shall consist of 22 senators. All 22 senators shall be duly elected by the people of Barbados. There shall be 2 senators from each parish, and each senator shall reside in the parish they represent during their tenure. The Senate shall elect a president and a vice
Ms.
president.
Carter, sorry to interrupt you. Can you repeat the last point you just made? We are taking careful notes.
B,
No, about the election of senators.
the Senate shall consist of 22 senators. All 22 senators shall be duly elected by the people of Barbados. There shall be 2 senators from each parish, and each senator shall reside in the parish they represent during their tenure. The Senate shall elect a president and a vice president of the Senate, and such other offices as it deems necessary. The Senate shall be duly constituted and shall conduct business with a 2/3 majority present. A quorum shall consist of a 2/3 majority. Voting may be by electronic means if allowed by the Senate. Members of Parliament. Members of Parliament, House, and/or Senate may be recalled by the election of 30% of the registered voters in that district, signing a petition to recall that member. All Senate and House members shall serve for a term of 5 years. A Prime Minister shall serve no more than 4 terms in office. Any member contesting an election in the House and/or Senate who has been convicted of a felony involving moral turpitude shall not be eligible to contest the election. The judiciary. The Chief Judge shall be appointed by the Prime Minister for a period of years and shall be removed only for cause or the appearance of impropriety. The Chief Judge shall manage the judiciary, and failure to manage the judiciary in a productive and efficient manner may constitute cause for the removal of the Chief Judge or any other judicial officer. Any judicial officer who fails to render decisions in a reasonable time continuously shall be removed for cause. Judicial officers shall be appointed to cases on the basis of their tenure, judicial experiences, educational background, the totality of their experiences, and their competency to handle the matters coming before the court. The judicial officers shall disclose any and all conflicts of interest or what may appear to be a conflict of interest to the parties appearing before the court. Judicial officers are precluded from accepting gifts from any person and/or corporation whose value exceeds 100 Barbados dollars. All judicial officers shall disclose any and all gifts offered and/or received by them while presiding on the bench. No judicial officer shall impose any orders on any party publishing and/or communicating any matters before the court unless that party appearing before the court can demonstrate that allowing the public right to know and have the matter publicized will severely prejudice the party and/or parties appearing before the court. Attorney fees. The court shall not award any party attorney fees or costs in matters considered to be in the public interest. The court shall only award attorney fees in matters where the written agreement, contract, or any other agreement in writing states that attorney fees may be awarded to the prevailing party. The court shall award reasonable attorney fees in matters where the statute states that the prevailing party may be awarded reasonable attorney fees. In matters involving the government, where the government shall be represented by the Attorney General, the court shall not award attorney fees to the government unless the matter was a nuisance, complaint, or without merit. The Attorney General and members of the Attorney General's office shall represent the government in all matters pertaining to the government unless such representation constitutes a conflict of interest. All matters filed in the court shall be considered public documents available to any member of the public, excluding matters involving children, matters pertaining to national security, and certain sensitive matters as deemed by the judge presiding over the matter. However, there shall be no presumption of privacy on behalf of the person seeking to keep the matter confidential. In fact, the presumption of confidentiality shall favor the petitioner seeking disclosure. A registrar and all employees in the office of the registrar who in the daily discharge of his or her duties fail to maintain the integrity of the official court records shall be removed for cause and may be subject to civil action by any party and or third party suffering actual damages. A court of competent jurisdiction may award a prevailing party punitive damages and reasonable attorney fees against the registrar and the government for acts of gross negligence, fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraudulent acts in the official discharge of duties. Since the Attorney General is a duly elected representative of the people, it is unconscionable to award the Attorney General attorney fees, especially in matters where all Barbadians have an interest in when the Attorney General is being paid to represent the government. The press. The press shall have the right to print and or publish all matters pertaining to government ministers, except for matters of national security, where publication may result in harm to the people and or the government of Barbados. The press shall only be liable for gross negligence, but shall not be liable for simple negligence. However, in the case where the press is guilty of simple negligence, the aggrieved party's sole remedy shall be a corrected note that should be published in a reasonable time after its discovery. The Auditor General. The Auditor General shall have the authority to compel ministers, permanent secretaries, and other subordinate staff to provide any and all information necessary to perform his or her duties. The Attorney General shall have the right to appear in court with counsel to require compliance with his or her request for information. The Auditor General shall not be an active member of any party and shall run for office exclusively on the basis of his or her requirements. The Auditor General shall serve for a period of years. The candidate for the position of Auditor General shall be required to meet all of the requirements of the position to be considered a candidate. The Auditor General shall disclose all gifts, but is precluded from accepting gifts from any institution with which he or she may have a business relationship. The Auditor General is precluded from accepting gifts in excess of 100 Barbadian dollars directly and or indirectly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Carter, for your presentation. Just as it relates to the Attorney General, is there any other comments other than what you would have said to us already as it relates to the Attorney General?
There is from me the Attorney General's office. For the office of the Attorney General, we are suggesting that the candidates for the office of the Attorney General shall have been practicing law for a period of no more than 5 years prior to being eligible to hold the office of the Attorney General. The Attorney General shall review all necessary and important documents to ensure their legality and ensure they meet the minimum constitutional standards. The Attorney General is the attorney for the government and people of Barbados and is not the personal attorney for the Prime Minister or any other government official unless the issue arises as a result of that government official conducting the people's business in their official capacity. Any and all government officials accused in their personal capacity of any violation of the law may retain legal counsel to represent him or her and shall not be represented by the office of the Attorney General.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Before you leave, I just give over to Senator Thompson. She just has a few questions for you.
Very well, thanks. Before I mean now?
Ms. Carter, I should like to thank you for clearly a very well thought out presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first is, did I understand you to say we, meaning that our view is? So are you presenting on behalf of a group, and would you tell us, please, the name of that group?
The group is made up of Barbadians who are truly standing in kindness, goodness, and they are the best. But as for a title, that's what we carry. We walk in kindness, in goodness, and we are the best.
May I ask how large this group is?
Yes, you want to know a number. It's growing daily, so it's fluid.
Fluid. Thank you. I was just curious. Okay. I have an observation, if I may. I want to make the point that the Commission is open to hearing all submissions, and we don't want to tell people what they should say at all, nor have we come to any conclusions on any issues, because this is really too early in the day. But I should like to point out to you what I think is an error in the language of your submission. I do not have a printed copy in front of me, but I understood you to say that the Attorney General should be an attorney of not more than 5 years standing. I think you mean not less than 5 years standing.
Okay.
Well, I mean, you may want an attorney who only has 5 years experience, but I think you mean one who has more than 5 years experience.
Okay. You're sharing with me your thoughts. You're not asking me a question.
But I'm also trying to solicit from you what it is the paper really intends to say. Are you saying that the Attorney General should be an attorney of only 5 years experience, which is what the language now says? Or was that an error, and are you saying that the Attorney General should be an attorney of more than 5 years experience?
Shall have been practicing law for a period of no more than 5 years.
Yeah, so the natural interpretation of the language is that you are saying that the Attorney General should have only 5 years experience. That's what as drafted it currently means.
Okay.
I won't go any further because I'm not appearing to want to badger you. I just want to be clear if that was the intent. And I do have a question arising out of the substance of the submission, and it is this. You spoke to the election of 22 senators. Does that mean that the Senate would no longer be an appointed chamber in your submission?
Exactly.
Okay. And you spoke to, or the paper rather, speaks to these 22 senators as 2 coming from every parish, of the 11 parishes.
Yes.
So, right. Now, we currently have a system of constituencies, and there are 30 constituencies across Barbados. And I am trying to get a sense of how you see this elected chamber of 22 people operating on the basis of parishes being reconciled or working along with, or perhaps getting rid of, a system of 30 elected parliamentarians which represent constituencies as opposed to parishes, and you could have as many as 3 or 5 constituent MPs representing a particular parish. Christchurch is 5 constituencies, for instance. In your Senate, that would have 2 representatives. So I'm just trying to see how the 2 bodies, the lower house with its 30 seats and your upper house with its 22, would currently function since both are to be elected chambers. I should really like if you could elaborate on the thinking and the view in relation to that matter, please.
Certainly, I will take your question to my team, and we will be happy to return to you with a collective after the collective discussion, return to you with that answer.
I welcome the democratic process that your people who walk in highness are taking, but I would wish you would bring them with you next time so that we could have the questions answered.
But I don't see the entire government here, so I can represent my team, and I think I did a sterling job this evening.
Touché.
To share, to present what they have come up with.
That was a very good answer, but it doesn't help us to get any closer to the answers. But thank you.
But I did say that the answer will come after discussion.
Okay, so do you intend to, you sent your paper, would you consider amending it based on any questions that might arise so that it helps us get a clearer understanding of the recommendations of your group?
Of course, all information that we receive, we will definitely discuss, and we will submit what we see as prudent in this time as we look to give the power to the people of Barbados. That's our interest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Carter. Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome, and thanks very much again for hearing us.
Right. For those who would have now joined us on the live stream, I just want to remind persons that we are the Parliamentary Reform Commission, which consists of Sir Richard Cheltenham, who is the chairman, Sir Leroy Trotman, who is the deputy chairman, Senator the Honorable Elizabeth Thompson, Commissioner Dr. Richard Ishmael, Commissioner Miss Maxine McLean, Mr. Corey Beckles, myself, Dr. William Chandler, Jr., and also Mr. Pedro Eastman, who is the Clerk of Parliament and the Secretary of the Commission. At this time, we are inviting any other persons who want to present. You can come to the microphone at this time.
Edwin.
Commissioners, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners,
Yeah.
good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Edwin O'Neill. So thank you for the opportunity once again, having spoken briefly last week. I don't know I have all of the solutions, but I certainly would want to invite you to direct your attention to some questions that I would want to put into the record. So the first thing that, and I hope I came in late because I'd indicated I was going to another meeting, so I hope I don't repeat what others may have said before me. So the first thing I'd like to introduce would be the Senate. What will be its role in the new republic? Now, we know that thus far it has been functioning somewhat akin to the House of Lords. I wanted to use a term of description, but I would refrain from that now. So I mean the description. So should we consider that the Senate can have some Americanisms introduced, where it becomes an elected chamber? Or can the Senate be a mix of elected and appointed members? I ask this because historically, that would have been intended to be a review chamber. I want to suggest that one, if an institution is going to function as a review chamber, there needs to be a level of experience. Experience in terms of professions, experience in terms of age. I have been young. I have now reached the point where I'm a senior citizen. And on issues, my thinking is vastly different to what it was 40 years ago. Some say that is the wisdom of experience. Some say that is maturity. So I want to suggest that if the Senate chamber is going to be the review chamber of what is done in the House of Assembly, that there would need to be a level of experience gathered there. And I would want to see a Senate, whatever form it takes, have a guaranteed place for labor. As I recall, ever since independence, there has been a labor presence in the Senate, up until very, very recently. I have argued that the modern democratic Barbados, or democracy in the modern Barbados, began with labor pangs. Labor also represents the largest non-racial constituency in Barbados. Every act of parliament is going to impact on labor. And if religious and cultural and other professional interests are written into the Constitution to be in the Senate in perpetuity, then I can think of no more compelling reason than why labor should not be there. And I invoke the spirits of Brian Zaline and those of the 25th of July, who were the forerunners of all that is now celebrated as dignity of labor. I would want to also invite the commissioners to seriously ask, how does one qualify for the Senate? It is pretty much now, given the construct, the prerogative of the Prime Minister and extend that to be the ruling party. But what qualifications does one need to qualify to be invited or appointed to the Senate? I think I've said enough about that chamber, and I'd like to move to the House of Assembly, the elected. And again, the first question that I would ask, well, I have a number of questions, so in this one. Should cabinet be selected from the House? The elected representatives. Now, we talk glibly about American system and the Westminster system. We know that the Westminster system, which we claim we are practicing, that cabinet members are selected from both houses, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. But we also talk about the American system, where a president is elected and he virtually picks who he wants to be the cabinet, whether it's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, so on and so forth, subject to confirmation by the Senate. I think that that is of particular interest to Barbados for two especial reasons. Cabinet members from the House are also constituency representatives. And I'm reminded of a statement by the Right Excellent Earl Walton Barrow, that if cabinet members did the job, then they would never be voted out. We in modern Barbados know that that's not always the case. And both parties have had trouncings which buried former cabinet ministers. So I think that that may be a point on which the Right Excellent erred. But I am also concerned about what representation a cabinet member can give to his local constituency. For example, Minister of Foreign Affairs, where they are virtually required to be traveling non-stop. And do we have the institutions sufficiently mature and developed to cover the lacuna in the absence of the cabinet member / representative? And I can think of no better reason to consider whether or not this should be the case than from the mouths of cabinet members who complain or voice the hardships, the uncertainties of life as a cabinet member while being a representative. And I am fully aware that in modern day Barbados, members of the House of Assembly perform roles out of necessity rather than what they should be doing or not doing. So there's a fire in the district. There are emergency and welfare institutions staffed by competent professionals, but invariably the face of the Prime Minister, of the elected member, is inserted in the goings-ons, and at points running the show, which is a clear violation, as I understand it, of the principles of separations of power. But perhaps politicians know better than most the price that
before
they
you continue, Mr. O'Neill, just as it relates to what your last comment on the separation of powers, can you explain to us how the separation of powers is violated, that principle is violated in that circumstance?
Certainly. So, the minister, as I understand it, is about setting policy, but referring to the same house fire in the night. That minister now comes and takes over the role of the welfare officer or the housing officer, where there are technocrats employed to do that job. And that's just a cursory example.
Thank you.
I'm also aware, I'm old enough to know, when there was a system of local government, the vestry system, which had a clear role, very locally, distinct from the representative of the constituency who sat in the House of Assembly. And I see where there is a morphing or coming together of those functions in modern Barbados. I do not think that we can seriously talk about deepening democracy or widening participation without having a process of recall. What is necessary to trigger such a recall? And in the absence of a recall, are we really living in an elected dictatorship where the citizen only practices democracy for less than 2 minutes once every 5 years? I also would want to invite the Commission to look at the role of the leader of the opposition. I am aware that there are several statements, given some appointments, where the leader of the opposition must be consulted. What is the level of that consultation? That's another discussion. I've lived long enough to have witnessed the DLP deliver a truncheon, and only 3 members of the BLP were elected. As much of a truncheon as that was, there was still a leader of the opposition able to emerge. And because lightning will strike in the same place twice, I also witnessed the DLP get a truncheon and reduce to only 2 members. Again, there was provision for a leader of the opposition to emerge. Those situations, I submit, were warning calls. Warnings because in 2018, the DLP was wiped out from in the House of Assembly. But there's still a requirement for a leader of the opposition to perform certain functions. But there's none in Parliament. And it was repeated again 3 years later. The filling of such a sensitive position, I submit, cannot be left to the whims and fancies or the considerations of individuals. I want to suggest a remedy. While we practice the first past the post system, to the victim belongs the spoils, I want to suggest that in such an unusual situation, where only one party is elected to the House, that we should fall back then on proportional representation to get members, how does it go? The majority of members who do not support the government, because the Prime Minister is appointed because the Prime Minister can command the support of the majority of members who support the government. While the opposition leader is the one who commands the support of the majority of members who do not support the government. So, we can arrive at the figures. I've submitted that there are 2 instances where numbers mattered or numbers were the outcome. So should it be 2, should it be 5, should it be 3 that are appointed with all the rights and privileges as if they were elected, and this only kicks in the event that one party wins all of the seats?
Okay, Mr. O'Neill, thank you for your submissions thus far. I'm going to kindly request that you just make one further point. You can always come back later to just enhance your presentation. But just one more point, because we want to leave some room for others to make their presentations.
You probably got a chance to get a sneak peek at my notes, sir, because I've just arrived at the end.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes. Are there any persons who would wish to comment?
Does anybody want to ask Edwin anything?
Mr. O'Neill, I'm just going to engage you for a little bit, right? So, firstly, thank you very much for your presentation. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge your reference to Darnley Brains Aline, who is my twice great uncle. Can you expand a little bit on why you think, or the path you got to saying that Labour is the greatest constituency, non-racial constituency in Barbados? And then after that, in practical terms, what would Labour representation in the Senate mean on a day-to-day basis in terms of Parliament's operation?
So one is only look at the collection of the group of workers and tell me if there's any other group in Barbados numerically superior to workers.
Well, I can't think of any, right? But,
so there we go. What was the second question?
On a day-to-day basis, in terms of the passage of legislation, etc., what, in your estimation, is the importance of having Labour representation in the Senate for the passage of legislation?
I think, first of all, it would be testimony to the sacrifices of those who labored before us. You are a young man, considerably younger than me. But even the worst ravages of the workplace, I did not experience. One has to talk to the older members and read Ambassador Morris and Dr. Cheltenham and Dr. Sir Roy to understand the level of exploitation that, and I come into a situation where there are levels of exploitation still today, but nowhere near what happened 1937 and all. It is easy to describe the events as riots, uprisings, which went across the entire Caribbean in that period of time. But I want to think that that was the statement of the ordinary people. That we, and indeed the evidence before the commissions, both the royal and the local one, was that we want a chance at fairness, we want a chance at rights, we want a chance at opportunities just like the other people. Now, if that, and it is not surprising therefore, that people like Grantley Adams and Sir Grantley Adams and Sir Hugh Springer hitched their wagons, and Sir Frank Walker hitched their wagons to that movement. Not because they were opportunistic, but because this was an opportunity to correct a grave injustice. And the large masses of people, uneducated as they were, needed a Moses, needed somebody to point, needed leadership. And they appointed them. And they provided that leadership. So, like I said, we have had some Goliaths as political leaders in this country. And they insisted that there had to be labor representatives in the Senate. And I say that against the background that if you're guaranteeing, and I use the term guarantee advisedly, if you're guaranteeing other groups a place in the Senate, then why not labor?
So let me ask you this question. What if someone replied to you and said, no group should be guaranteed representation in the Senate? And for example, like the last presentation made, all members of the Senate should be elected and whoever wins gets in the Senate. What's your reply to that?
I heard one of the very distinguished commissioners many years ago said the success of Barbados has been a process because we embark on a process of gradualism and not extremism. I don't know if Dr. Cheltenham remembers that conversation. So I'm not going to argue against anybody who thinks that the Senate should be an elected chamber. What I would strongly urge is that those contending views meet, and perhaps a hybrid situation or a distinctly Barbadian variation can emerge from entertaining contending views. I also learned that political systems do not move very far away from their origins. You tinker with them, you modernize them, you modify, but you don't overthrow. So I say that, I make the statement against the background of those many nuggets of wisdom.
So you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation a difference between the younger you and the older you. Did the younger you want to overthrow?
As all young people do.
So the young people today in Barbados, those who may be watching, right, and wanting a movement far away from the system we have now, what would be your reply to them, or what is your reply to them?
That's where the older heads come and give guidance rather than restraining. Remember, today's revolutionary is tomorrow's conservative.
Okay, so I just have one more thing. You mentioned the leader of the opposition. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer since what I'm about to say is going to be a bit volatile. So the disclaimer is this. It is not my opinion. I am only asking you the question to elicit a response, right? So there are those who say, where you do not have a leader of the opposition, there should be some accommodation made for the leader of the opposition to emerge in Parliament or be appointed to. Now, whether it's the Senate or the House of Assembly, who knows? Now, what about those who say that the election result under the first past the post system is the will of the people, and if there is no opposition leader, there should be none? And the corollary, or the second point to that, is that there are parts of democracy that we don't experience all the time, that being an absolute majority. And in that circumstance, we have to expect that there will be even greater responsibility on those who've won the election to refrain from doing things that would not be in the best interest of the society, and it can only mature the society greater. What's your response to that?
Man being what he is, I think it was Lord Acton who said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If there is no, I could talk some more about the cabinet being subjected to the will of the House. But inherent in that is that cabinet must be a minority so that the backbench can keep them in check. I said very clearly, the case of a total wipeout is unusual. And it is only at that point that I am prepared to entertain another facility so that a leader of the opposition can emerge by the will of the people so that the constitutional arrangements can continue to function, such as the leader of the government.
You say emerge by the will of the people, but didn't the people vote in the general election and then you do not have an opposition leader? Aren't you nullifying that popular majority?
Not at all, sir, because there is still a significant number of people who voted that did not vote for government.
And in a country where you have majority rule, shouldn't the minority subsist at some point?
I think that the voice of the minority must always be heard. And therefore, an alternate proportional representation only after there has been a clean sweep ensures that the voice of the minority is still heard.
All right, thank you very much.
Oh, Mr. O'Neill, please
Chair.
don't go.
Chair, with your permission, Brother Edwin, I heard you going to the subject of proportional representation. I'm hearing that you're indicating that there should be conditionalities. But would you want to develop this idea of proportional representation, stating clearly what you mean by the conditionalities, and also presenting a position for the Commission that speaks to a vision that you may have of proportional representation that does not limit to conditionalities as well?
So I am quite happy with the first past the post system. I think that I've said several times here tonight that I'm only prepared to consider the proportional representation in the event of a clean sweep. Now, whatever figures you use, the government is elected by what? In Barbados or statistics, I didn't research this one tonight, but the statistics are somewhere around 53, 47. There's 47% of those who voted that have no representative in the House. In the meanwhile, the government has got the entire clean sweep. I am suggesting that based on the fact that the other party got 47% of the votes, provides a pathway to select some opposition members who will elect or select their leader. And I mentioned the two extremes that occurred hitherto 2018. And for absolute clarity, such a scenario would only be employed if there is a clean sweep by one party.
But if you are creating a new system by which we will govern ourselves, are you proposing to us that we should structure that on the basis of ifs and buts and howevers?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, but don't leave as yet. Your presentation would have sparked our interest as it relates to inquiring, which is part of our responsibility to inquire into the opinions of the public. And I give over to Senator Thompson, who has a few questions for you.
Mr. O'Neill, again, thank you very much.
Here.
You posed a number of questions to which you gave no answers. While we are titillated, or certainly I am, by the questions, we would really wish to hear the recommendations of the public rather than substitute our own answers before we get answers from the public. So if I may turn your questions on you, may I ask how, in your opinion, apart from the criterion of age, and which you equate with experience, would one qualify to serve in the Senate? I would wish to ask as well whether or not you, beyond labor, there are particular interest groups that you think should be represented in the Senate. That's one. Your second question that caught my attention was should the cabinet be selected from the lower house? If, in your view, members of cabinet do not come from the lower house, where would you want them to come from? Are you suggesting that they should come from the Senate, or are you suggesting that we have some new kind of hybrid model? And I am not averse. Barbados led on things like the establishment of a tripartite committee to deal with labor and social relations. So I am not averse as a commissioner to hearing somebody suggest a new model, a hybrid model, an indigenous model that we can then share with the world. But you have to articulate it. You can't ask me the question and leave, or ask us the question and leave the question there. So my question would be, where, if in your view, cabinet should not be selected from the lower house, where would you want cabinet members to come from, and how would they be selected, by what means? And then it was part of your argument then that ministers are too busy and therefore should not seem to have constituency responsibilities. I don't want to speak in defense of parliamentarians. I think that I can share with you that the Commission is actually contemplating inviting former parliamentarians from both sides of the political divide to speak to the public about what it is ministers and parliamentarians do, so that we can have a better idea and be able to extrapolate from the arguments made what kind of system would best suit us and whether we should change the system that we currently exist. But let me say to you that while you speak in terms of house fire at night and ministers or constituency representatives, parliamentarians inserting themselves into the process, I can tell you, as one who has responded to the call of a fire at midnight, at 2 o'clock, at 3 in the morning, that you are the only person who is available. There is no government office open at that time that people with fires can call. And invariably, it is the parliamentarian who is helping to lift around furniture that was saved, find somewhere for the people to sleep, get a house for them as a matter of urgency. You are first there engaging in the morning rather than them having to engage with multiple agencies like welfare and housing, national housing and so on. You're the one invariably who finds the first bed and set of food vouchers for them to go to the supermarket. It doesn't come from the government agencies at 3 o'clock in the morning. It comes from the parliamentarians, you believe me. And I think you know that too, sir, because I know it has been part of your experience.
So you've given me a hefty amount to respond to.
Yes.
I think, in fairness, though, I should have said, I did say, some parliamentarians are inserting themselves in the relief effort. Inherent in that is they can only insert when others have been there. And I too have responded. But I've not had the trappings of the parliamentary weight.
You did not run, sir.
Exactly. Fortunately, yeah. And I'm not seeking to get anything out of that. I have done so only as a humanitarian, because it is a traumatic experience at that time. But the fact that the parliamentarian inserts themselves, contrary to what you say, it means that those functionaries have been alerted and are there.
No, not at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Pardon? Okay. The process of selection of cabinet. There's been a lot written and said about the political culture. It is what we have inherited. The King of England exercised tremendous control and influence over the colonies and the structures. In modern Barbados, I want to suggest that the King of the United States exercises even more control and influence through TV. And therefore, the culture of the American experience is going to seep in to the Barbadian situation. Now, like I said, I didn't have all the answers. But I wanted to excite your imagination. I wanted to point you in some directions that you may want to consider as we look at making Parliament a more democratic, a more in touch, a more responsive institution to the needs of Barbadians. I would be happy to research the subject of what other qualifications persons can bring or should be considered as a qualification to sit in a chamber that is essentially a review, or is it, amongst its functions, is to review the legislation coming from the lower house. I think I missed one of the other questions that you posed, because I cannot write as quickly as you would have spoken.
Sorry. Was that should cabinet be elected? Cabinet being selected from the lower house, ministers and MPs, the clash between functions. No, I think you covered them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Neill. Is there any other person? Yes, sir. You can go to the microphone. Oh, yeah.
Good evening, all. Chair,
Good evening.
and members of the Reform Committee. My name is Buddy Laria, and I am not familiar, I haven't studied the Barbados parliamentary system. So my contribution is coming from a completely different perspective, and I want you to hear me. And one of the questions I would ask is if it is possible for me to have a meeting with the commission or the committee at some point. This is very important because I represent, or coming from a perspective based on the event we had, or the events that we have had during the last 2 months here in Barbados, which culminated last night at the lecture and discussion on the remembrance of the trade in Africans and its abolition, and the question of reparatory justice. And I would say that I represent a significant number of Barbadians in the diaspora, because that's my base. And I could speak with authority on that. But listening to what has been happening with the Constitutional Committee, and now, which I'm very pleased, that the President of Barbados has asked for reform process to listen to the people of Barbados. So I'm very, very pleased, extremely pleased. And this put me back to thinking that presently we are in the process of 1955, when the Democratic Labour Party was formed. Because what we had was the Barbados Labour Party, which we have now, that gave birth, or the process gave birth to the Democratic Labour Party. And what was the process? The process was people crossing the floor from the Barbados Labour Party and establishing the Democratic Labour Party. And a few months after that process, something happened to Barbados. Hurricane Janet hit Barbados and transformed Barbados. I hope you get the point I'm making, because we are at a point when Barbados needs to be careful. And I say this, and I'll conclude with this: if it is possible to speak to you all. In 1977, I had a vision of Barbados. That vision is well known because there are 5 books on Amazon that speaks to the matter. And only last week, I penned a letter to all 25 ministers of government. So I'm saying to you all that I am concerned. The crossing of the floor begs to ask 2 questions. 1, are you going with the political parties that in law does not exist? The reason why is no political party is represented in the House of Parliament. That was the last constitution, not represented. And what is even more insidious is that Barbadians do not know that on the ballot paper, no political party is mentioned. And people argue strongly that they see DLP and BLP on the ballot paper. Even last week, I had this conversation. So the people of Barbados are awakening. They need to understand the history of Barbados. And former parliamentarian Bobby Morse started to take us down that road last week when he gave an overview of the history of Barbados. The people of Barbados do not know their history, and therefore some is talking about the local government that the BLP is now introducing. I was part of the process with the DLP of Constituency Council, and we're moving now into another. So we need to have some clear information given to the people of Barbados, not only in Barbados, but the diaspora, because the government is asking the people of the diaspora to come home and be part of the new Barbados. I close with this. We are moving towards, in the next 4 years, or during the next 4 years, We are going to be speaking about the 400th anniversary of Barbados as a colony, and where do we go from there? So these discussions needs to have a different dynamic to help people to understand that Barbados is 396 years old as Barbados. And we got 4 years to put something in place that would take Barbados to the position which it is presently, let's say, indicating that it's going, and that is to have a powerful voice in the world. And all of you know that it's happening, but there's something that needs to be done. I thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. With regard to your question, just leave your information with us at the end of the session. Thank you. Are there any other persons with us who would like to comment? I just want to read a comment from, this is on Facebook Live. This is a comment from Mr. Wayne Hoyt. And he's saying the head of each branch of government should report to the president. And he mentions some specific posts, the Chief Justice, the PM, and the Speaker of the House. And it's just one of the comments on the live stream. All right, any other persons? Oh, we have someone.
Good night to the Commission, and good night to the audience, and good night to the President of the Senate. My name is Devron Bruce. I know the Commission is aware of some of my views as it relates to parliamentary reform, so I would not repeat those areas. What I would start with tonight, though, is a bit of a word of caution. I'm seeing some interest in the idea of an elected Senate, and I would propose that the Senate, by and large, remains as it is. Now, the idea around an elected Senate tends to come from a presidential system, where the general idea is that the upper house can diametrically oppose the decisions of the lower house, hence separation of powers. But what we have in our system is a majoritarian system enforced by our electoral system. So if we head in the direction of electing a Senate, quite frankly, we'll just reproduce the lower house. And you're reproducing the lower house in a way that it does not have, in essence, the right to fundamentally oppose the lower house. So you're just reproducing the lower house in a partisan way, and I don't think there's any practical benefits to having that reproduction. So I think we really have to think through the idea of an elected Senate. You're not solving any real issues. Now, I would move on and say that one of the concerns that I have within our parliamentary system is that our Constitution grants the Prime Minister the ability to call an election at will. Now, an election ought to be a democratic exercise. But when we have a circumstance where a Prime Minister, which I, on my perspective, consider them the most partisan individual in our political system, because they carry the number of most partisan persons in a house, hence they become Prime Minister, then political strategy and partisanship are often foremost on the minds of that position. So introducing partisanship and introducing political strategy into what ought to be a democratic process, I think, is problematic. And this is not coming out of nowhere. We've seen early elections in 1994, for instance. I believe it would have been 2 years and 4 months early, 2003, 8 months early, 2022, 2 years and 6 months early, for instance. So what I would recommend is that In the instance of elections, I would remove the ability of the Prime Minister to solely call an election by themselves. And rather, it ought to be it should be taken to Parliament. Whether we determine the lower house and the upper house have to make that decision, the fundamental has to be that it is taken to Parliament to make that determination. Now, timestamps matter. When are you able to call that election? What time period are you able to call that election? I would personally propose that you cannot have an early election in our system until parliamentarians have served 3.5 years of their term. If you wish to have an election after that, you must take it to Parliament and receive a 2/3 majority vote for that election to occur. So that would be my first proposal. Now, staying on the topic of elections, much discussion has been had before regarding the absence of an opposition leader, for instance. I will not again repeat my position on these issues because I know the Commission is aware of them. But what I would say is that the Constitution already recognizes the importance of an opposition leader. The name is riddled throughout our Constitution. So therefore, I believe that our Constitution also has to guarantee the existence of an opposition leader. My position, quite frankly, is well known, so that is all I would say on that matter. Now, as it relates to other aspects of our parliamentary system, some of the key individuals in our parliament would be individuals such as the Speaker of the House, who is responsible for the management of the House, who is responsible for the protection and the rights of those within the House, and I would say the majority, or rather the minority in the House. So given the importance of the Speaker of the House, I think objectivity matters. If your job is to administer the business of the House, if your job is to protect the members of the House, then objectivity and impartiality matters. Yet, we have a circumstance where the Prime Minister, in essence, determines who the Speaker of the House is. And I've made my case in stating that there is no person in our political system more partisan than a Prime Minister because they carry the majority of those who admit partisanship. So what I would suggest in that instance, to enhance the capacity and enhance the impartiality of the Speaker of the House, is that the Speaker of the House not be selected from within Parliament. Because parliamentarians are admittedly partisan people. So what you would have is an instance where the Speaker of the House is selected outside of Parliament by the President in the first instance. And that individual is then taken to Parliament for a vote to be determined. No, you can't have a vote in Parliament without having a Speaker of the House, and there are ways around that I can certainly discuss. But the fundamental is that the President should determine who the Speaker of the House should be to introduce a greater level of impartiality within the system. If it goes to vote and there's a failure, for instance, I believe that, quite frankly, then you introduce the Prime Minister and then you introduce the Leader of the Opposition and the President. They can determine who they want and it is taken to the House. But fundamentally, it will start with the fact that the Speaker of the House should be elected or determined by the President and voted upon by parliamentarians. Quite similarly, I think the Attorney General should have a very similar process of appointment. Similar argument, the Attorney General is appointed by the Prime Minister, admittedly a partisan person, but law and the promotion of law ought not to be undermined by politics and undermined by impartiality, or rather by partiality. So I would also introduce the idea of the Attorney General arising outside of Parliament as well. So they're introduced from outside of Parliament through the election, or rather the appointment of the President. Very similar approach towards the Speaker of the House. Now, when we think of broadening our democracy within our parliamentary system, I think what is often missing is the fact that we have a circumstance where our parliament governs itself. There are only a few instances where the people have, I would say, almost an absolute say over parliament, and we know that it's during an election. Now, I think we need to consider introducing things into our parliamentary system, such as question time, where you have the members of parliament and the prime minister being subjected to, and let me not use subjected sounds like almost like a negative word, being exposed to the views of other individuals and questions from other individuals within our society. In the most practical terms, you apply to parliament to attend question time, and you come into parliament and you ask questions of your parliamentarians. You ask questions of your ministers, you ask questions of your prime minister. I would also introduce the idea of a petition system, whereby we have a sufficient amount of individuals saying that something ought to be raised or discussed. When that threshold is met, there is a trigger that ensures that such discussions are had. So I would also introduce that as a way to really begin to broaden our democracy by including processes whereby individuals who do not reside in parliament can still participate on a regular basis. Now, part of the discussion tonight was based somewhat on political parties. And I think that it is important that we recognize it is time that Barbados heads in a direction where political parties are recognized within law, whether at a constitutional level or otherwise. I think it is absolutely vital, because you have a circumstance where political parties want to govern a system, but they are not governed by the system they want to govern, which I find to be problematic. Just last week in the Senate, we've seen a very practical instance as to why political parties ought to be recognized. One of the senators raised the fact that part of the integrity legislation ought to include issues of campaign finance. But it is difficult now to introduce such topics such as campaign finance if political parties have no legal standing in our systems. So how then do we ensure that the way political parties are financed are fair? And you see, our system already recognizes this, because if you look at the electoral laws that we have, for instance, the Europa, candidates are already required to declare where their money comes, because the idea is that money ought not to heavily influence electoral outcomes. So if we recognize this already in our law, that money and politics can almost head in a direction which is not positive, we need to expand on that. So we already recognize it at the candidacy level, but we need to also recognize it now at the party level. So I think that we really have to head in a direction where we recognize that political parties ought to be placed within our constitutional framework, and it allows for several other interventions that we may want to do in the future, whether it is public finance of campaigns, whether it is the introduction of, let's say, national MPs, whether it is the selection of persons into the Senate. It makes the process a lot easier when we know what a political party is, when we can hold these political parties accountable, and when we can, in essence, govern these political parties. So those are some of, I would say, the key areas that I would raise tonight of concern. There are several other areas. The Public Accounts Committee, for instance, I believe ought to be reformed, where the opposition leader does not chair the Public Accounts Committee, but the president is now in place to select not only the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, but several other members that are not inside of Parliament. Because again, we cannot continue to have a circumstance where parliamentarians govern parliamentarians. The guardian cannot guard the guardian. It just logically does not make any sense. So what we need to do is to introduce elements of independence into our political system. And I would propose to the committee that the president selects a majority of members of the Public Accounts Committee, whereas the opposition and the prime minister, or rather the government, appoint similar numbers. So I would say government gets 3, opposition gets 3, and the president gets 7, so we ensure that the business of the Public Accounts Committee can always, in essence, be met and not be subjected to the usual partisan rancor that we get and issues of quorums and everything else. So those are some of the key things that I think we have to start thinking about when we think of our parliamentary system, elections, broadening democracy, and just furthering including, I would say, independence and impartiality into our political system. Because the reality is that our parliamentarians do not have the monopoly of truth, and we need to rely more heavily within and on our societies to contribute to our governance system. So I would put that out there for now.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Bruce. Since we are classmates, you know, I won't resist asking you a few questions, right? And hopefully it will help the public as well in terms of forming questions and being able to go a bit deeper into the various issues. So the first one is this. You recommended basically what you may consider, well, you recommended an Attorney General who would come from outside of Parliament, who I guess in your mind would be fully independent, yes?
You're never fully anything, but you're more independent than the other one.
Okay, so let's go on that more independent part. What would you say to someone who says that that cabinet should be able to select the attorney of its choice, and that cabinet, being by its very nature political, should have an attorney who by its nature is political as well? Would you say that is a good argument or a bad argument or something in between?
I would say that we have to start thinking about these things at a constitutional level. What I am proposing are constitutional recommendations and not political recommendations. What you have proposed is a political one. So you can have your political solution with a Minister of Justice who can have a quite similar role, quite frankly, to what an Attorney General does. But that position is not constitutionalized, and it is not, therefore, reliant on the whims of partisanship, the whims of politics, the whims of a cabinet. Our Constitution has to, in many ways, rise above those things.
Let me come in on that point. Constitutions, because the Parliamentary Reform Commission sits at an interesting crossroad, right? Parliament as an institution is formed and entrenched in the Constitution. Then there are statutes that apply to Parliament, etc., and there are political practices that apply to Parliament and the parliamentary system of government overall. Now, the Attorney General, now you spoke about political constructions and constitutional constructions, but isn't a constitution by its very nature a political instrument? It is constraining and forming and liberating various levels of power, and we're both students of political science. We know that it's a study of power, contrary to what people think is just realpolitik. But when you're looking at it, aren't we, if you have an institution such as the Attorney General that is supposed to be giving advice to a constitutional body, which by its nature is political with economic, social, cultural effects, shouldn't there be then the choice and the freedom of a political actor who is able to advise on the law as a lawyer, as an attorney at law, but still have some hint of political flavor, for lack of a better term?
I would say no. The reason I would say that is because the role of the Attorney General is foremost law. And the principle of law is that it is law, it is not politics. So again, you can have your political element in your cabinet with a Minister of Justice. Everything the Attorney General does, in essence, when it comes to advising a political party in cabinet, the Minister of Justice can do that. But the role of the Attorney General, quite frankly, is a national position, a constitutional and national position that I believe ought not to be rendered under a cabinet system. And I think other territories have recognized this. The Jamaican system has now, for some time, appointed the Attorney General from outside of cabinet. for the exact reasons that I have said. So you're respecting law, and you're understanding that conflicts of interest exist. And yes, constitutions are, in essence, political, I would say, writing, so to speak. But what type of writing do you wish to have? What type of system do you wish to have? And if you're recognizing that conflicts of interest exist, how do you reduce those conflicts of interest? And that fundamentally is where my personal philosophy lies. So introducing independence, reducing conflicts of interest is important within our political system because we already established two entities that are already admittedly partisan. You have your prime minister, you have an opposition leader. Where is the middle? Where we need to go is an introduction of the middle. And that middle has to be one that at least says or attempts to be partisan and is more rather independent as opposed to partisan. So from my perspective, what we need is an introduction of a middle. We already have the two ends sorted already.
Let's talk about that middle for a minute, because the same principle is arising in that recommendation you made for the speaker, right? Now, part of democracy is being able to rise to the occasion or rise above the fray when it comes to certain offices, right? So when a person assumes the office of speaker, that person is supposed to have a level of impartiality. Are you suggesting that that is impossible to achieve?
It is not impossible to achieve, but it would rather guarantee it as opposed to rely on the individual to do what they ought to do. So why are we relying on the whims and fancies of an individual to be impartial when we could institute something that grants further impartiality? That is what systems do. We don't rely on individuals, rely on systems. And it is not systematic to rely on an individual to wake up today and determine today I'm going to be partisan and the other day I'm not going to be partisan. That is not systematic. That is relying on an individual, and I don't think national systems ought to be subjected to that type of treatment.
So, so what would you say to someone who says that systems only comprise people and that the Constitution itself prescribes a system that relies, one, on the rules that constrain people, but also on the moral character of the individuals, right? And to that extent, when you start to prescribe to basically the letter every single thing that people are supposed to do to the point that they may even have to think a certain way, that you're really denying people the experience of good, orderly government and propriety and good moral character in public life.
And I fundamentally agree with you that both have to exist. The moral character of an individual has to exist, and the system also should be in place to enforce it. The argument that I'm making is that we have a system and it is inadequate. So my proposals are to how do we enhance the system. It's not me rejecting the fact that persons can be moral. It is me simply saying there's an inadequacy in what we currently use within our system.
Mr. Bruce, I'm so glad you stated it in that way, because I do want to ask a question, which is this. What mischief, malfunction, or dysfunction, or egregious act has been so committed in the history of the system that we have by the office holders of the post of Attorney General or Speaker that you need to uproot the system and correct it? And by your argument, or a logical extension of that, should a Minister of Health be a non-political doctor, for instance, to be a proper Minister of Health? I mean, where does one stop?
So I don't think I'm uprooting anything at all. I am simply following on principles that already exist. We would not put a judge in a court that is admittedly partisan. Separation of powers already exists within our system. I'm simply adding to principles we already recognize. So if you're saying...
But you haven't told me what is the egregious wrong that needs to be corrected, because I'm not yet persuaded that there is.
So should we wait until the wrong has occurred, or should we protect before it happens? There are several things that have not occurred.
I don't know of any system that is completely exempt from wrong occurring, no matter how you attempt to purge it.
I completely agree, and I continue to say that I am here to enhance, not to perfect. Only enhance, not to perfect. And from my perspective, if we're saying that the role of Attorney General is in essence to be the custodian of law, then placing that individual into a cabinet, which is fundamentally a partisan place, ought not to occur, because the pressures of that space, the direct pressures of that space, can undermine, in principle, whether or not we've had it in an instance as yet, I think is immaterial and irrelevant. But in a system and systematically doing that is problematic, and you're asking for problems. And others have already recognized this problem, like Jamaica, for instance.
I get the argument. There's nothing wrong with it, but let me mash it up anyway and try to improve it. Got you.
Mr. Bruce, so, so the last point here, there was a presentation earlier that spoke about directly electing a prime minister. From your professional point of view, what are the pros and cons of that for the public elucidation?
Well, it can be done, but I think it requires quite a bit of change, because you're operating, and again, in a majoritarian system, and one that is governed by a fusion of powers. If you have a circumstance whereby you may elect a prime minister, but then the MPs that you elect are from a completely different partisan position, you're asking for chaos. So I am in agreement that the majoritarian system ought to be maintained, because the government, quite frankly, should have the ability to institute its policies onto a system. And our system, again, is not designed to juxtapose itself. You don't want a circumstance where a prime minister is on one end, the parliament is on another end, because then you have problems, and I think unnecessary problems. Our system is a fusion for continuity as opposed to division and juxtaposing each other. So I would not recommend that system at all. Similar to why I would not elect a Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Just to inform everyone here, Mr. Devron Bruce, he is a political scientist from the University of the West Indies, and we thank you for your presentation. Right, at this time, His Excellency Bobby Morris would like to present.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, Deputy Chairman, the members at the head table. And distinguished members of the audience, and those who are listening on. I'm glad for the opportunity to make some comments. These are personal comments coming from myself. And having looked at the history of our country's development from 1625 until now, I just want to make a few observations. First of all is that this is the second time that we are a republic. We were there between 1649 and 1660, so it's not the first time around at all. And out of that first republic, we have the Charter of Barbados, and that is in our Constitution. So let's understand that. It's not a first time for us. I believe that every single Barbadian is satisfied, everyone, that we're going in the right direction. It can only be a republic. Can't be anything else. We can't stand where we are, because we stood there from 66 to now for a particular reason. For a particular reason. But as you go through the history of Barbados, what are the important things in terms of elections, parliament, and politics, and parliament? Who voted? That's one of the first things you're looking at. Who got the right to vote? It starts out with who could not vote. Blacks could not vote. They got the vote. Free colors could not vote. They got the vote. Women could not vote. They got the vote. So Barbadians can vote now. So then it became something about age. Started with 21. We went to 18. Who says it can't go to 16? Is the 18-year-old of 10 years before any more educated than a 16-year-old today? So if we're looking at a possibility of saying we want to extend the electorate, a good question is, why not your 16-year-old? That 16-year-old has the right to have a license, a driver's license. I haven't heard anybody discussing that. That 16-year-old is most likely at Harrison College or Foundation, if he has much sense, or Combermere or some other school. So why couldn't a 16-year-old, especially if you get into the proper habit of teaching civics to every child in school? There is not a child in Barbados that should not be taught civics from the time he hits the secondary school. And by the time he gets to fifth form, he should be able to get a certification in civics. Fundamental, because you're asking him to be a citizen, but you haven't taught him what it is to be a citizen. So that's a question we can ask. Then we can ask the question, who got the vote? Well, we divided Barbados into something called parishes at first. And parishes were given each one as a constituency, and then you say give the city 2 votes too. So you had 11 by 2, and then 2 in the city. Those were the electors. But you really need 30 constituencies in Barbados? Tell me why you need them. Tell me why you need 30 constituencies in this 2 by 3 place. Tell me. Tell me what the real logic is.
How many?
Tell me what the logic is to have 30 constituents.
How many?
I know what we want.
How many?
We don't really need any big lot of constituencies with politicians and so on. What we need, high-quality public servants. We have to spend more money in the people who have to deliver programs. Politicians don't deliver programs. They come up with policies that they recommend in their manifestos, etc. And then it's the public sector that has to deliver, and the private sector working with them. And what I want to see in Barbados are highly qualified public servants that can deliver in every area. Highly qualified public servants that can deliver, rather than more and more politicians being elected to our House of Assembly. Now, on this question, for instance, I understand that there's the Thorn Commission was looking at the question of a kind of new vestry. You make it work. You're going to take our money and spend it on a vestry system? That is dead. That is dead. Dormant, gone. We do not need that. So don't waste that money at all. If you dismiss the Constituency Council, don't come with the vestry. It is manageable within the context of parishes still, believe me. It's still manageable. And in fact, we can take some of those constituencies and merge them so they act as kind of zones. Eastern zone, northern zone, central zone, western zone. And distribute the work in the zones, give more zonal responsibility. You look back over the history of Barbados that the things have been tried and have been tossed out. And you ask questions about why. And the things that have been introduced gradually over time to satisfy groups and to satisfy interests. The group and the interests we have to satisfy in Barbados are citizens of Barbados right now. That is fundamental. And the other thing we need to be getting ready for is the fact that this narrow concept of being a Barbadian, we are West Indians, and we have to work to get that togetherness in the region again. That's fundamental as we talk about our own constitution. let us see some passion coming from Barbadian politicians and everybody else about regionalism. It is fundamental. This small island mentality is killing the region. And we have to get past that, because it's still about insularity, it's still about parish. And from parish now we want to go down to small constituency, vestry things and so on. We're not going back small, we're going big. That's where we have to. We have to expand our minds and our thinking in terms of the fact that we are now in an era and a time that smallness is really beautiful, yes, but it's also disadvantageous. You have to be able to think large, and you have to train your people to be accepting the challenges of the world, the universal challenges. So don't think small. That's not a big thing anymore. It's not going to get you anywhere. I just want to make one more comment. Now, we have something called a social partnership. Edwin, I'm not hearing you people talking about this is the 30th year of the social partnership. You don't celebrate something like that after 30 years? What's happening to you fellas? 30 years? If it was a political party, parties would be keeping noise. 30 years old. You are 30 years old. You started a social partnership. Are you sure what you have? Do you know what you have there? I want you all to think about it very seriously, because if that is going to be part of the Barbados of the future, it might not be in the Constitution as such, but if that is going to be the structural Barbados of the future, you have to be very careful about what a social partnership is. Because the trade union, a body of labor, in bed with two employers, you better be wary. You better understand what you're doing. Employers, organizations embed with government as an employer and the private sector as an employer, and you're in bed with them. Be careful here. Listen, a good live-in is different from a marriage. And therefore, sometimes you form an alliance for a time, but you don't see it as a marriage. You come out, and you go back in when you feel like, because there's an advantage in your going back in. But when you stay in it, boy, you get squeezed. So all of you have to be political in your thinking. Politicians think all the time. Believe me, they're strategic in their thinking. And what they think about is power. Just as businessmen think about this. What does the trade union think about? I ask you. It must be justice. It must be rights for the people you represent. It's not about power. You don't have it. If you really think you have it, you don't have it. And you don't have wealth. But you have the capacity to deliver benefits and rights. So don't go stuck in an avenue that you can't get back out of. Don't make permanent what should be temporary, strategic. Go in and come out. Go in and come out. And then nobody's too sure where you are. They can't lock you down. That is about understanding how to use power. And my last point is this. We have some ethnic groups that came into Barbados relatively late, yesterday. Blacks can vote, then they got the vote, da-da-da-da. Women can vote, then they can get the vote. Now, migrants. There is no ethnic community that should have a special place in our Constitution. You can't make a provision. Sorry, my friend Kofdewala, we're friends. You're my sons and me and your family. We're friends. But when they told me that they were going to make a place for you in the Senate, I said, my friend, that is grossly wrong. You will get it in the House when you run and win a seat. you will get it.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
but we don't want to, as it relates to parliamentary reform, we know of certain events that transpired as it relates to Parliament, but we wish you to focus more as it relates to enhancing
That
Parliament.
will come from others.
Yeah,
This is my presentation, sir, and I'm finishing now. But I'm making my point. My constitution is not to be played with or tampered with for special purposes. Thank you very much. Good night.
Grateful, sir. Is there any other comments?
Mr. Morris, sorry. I just wanted to ask a quick question. You said that 30 constituencies were too many. Had you considered what would be an ideal number in our setting? Okay, thank you. For the purposes of the public who would not have heard Mr. Morris respond offline, Mr. Morris said it was his question to us as to whether 30 constituencies were really necessary in our setting. Is that correct? Yes. We move there gradually by a process. But we must now ask ourselves if we need that in a small 166 square miles. My question to him was, what did he consider to be an ideal number? So I simply repeated for the benefit of those online what Mr. Morris said, because he had moved away from the microphone. We do have people online.
Yes, 2 questions, and unless there are any other persons who wish to comment, before we end, I just want to raise these 2 questions that were placed online. The first question is, what is the definition of cabinet? What is the definition of cabinet? And the second question, does Barbados currently have a constitution? Does Barbados currently have a constitution? And those are the 2 questions. The first question, I'm going to invite Senator Thompson to answer.
I'm going to attempt to be detailed so that there is clarity for the online questioner. In an election, people are elected to represent one of 30 constituencies, or in a total of 30 constituencies at the moment. The group getting the larger number forms the government. The group getting the smaller number forms the opposition. The individual who is able to command the majority of the minor group, the smaller group, becomes leader of the opposition. The individual who is able to command the majority of those in the larger group becomes the prime minister. After an election, those persons are regarded as members of parliament. The members of parliament will be on the government side and on the side of the opposition. Members of cabinet are those persons who run government, run is incorrect, who are responsible for the leadership of policy development within the ministry or within a ministry. So you have a minister of health, you may have a minister of social affairs, you may have a minister of education, and the ministers of government are selected from amongst the government side by the Prime Minister in his or her sole discretion. Those members of the winning side who are not chosen by the Prime Minister to become ministers and lead policy in government, in government offices or ministries are known as the backbench. I think that I have been fairly clear. I hope I have.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. As it relates to the second question on the Constitution, the chair. Right. As it relates to the second question, the chair will respond to that question. but I want to, before the chair comes, who will also give the vote of thanks, I just want to, from my position, just say thank you to all of you who would have presented here in the audience, here at the Foundation School, but also those who would have presented online, made comments online, were present online. And we had just under 300 persons who would have joined with us online. And we're grateful for your attendance here. And for those who are online, I'm also grateful for your attendance. At this time, I want to invite the chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission, Sir Richard Cheltenham, and he will address you on that question and also give the vote of thanks. Right, Sir Richard Cheltenham, he is going to go to the podium.
Good night, Mr. Chairman and fellow commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. Before I make concluding remarks, I wish to respond to a question which has been posed, and that is whether Barbados currently has a constitution. The short answer to that is yes, we certainly do have a constitution, but it has been recognized that following a republican status, we are no longer a monarchy, we are republican status. It has become necessary to revisit the Constitution and bring it in line with a republican status. And that is the reason that informs the appointment of Mr. Christopher Blackman's Constitutional Commission. But until that commission has reported and its recommendations accepted either in full or in part only, and then we change our Constitution, the 1966 Constitution, which we had at independence and which has gone through some modifications, remain in place. The short answer, therefore, is that we still have a constitution in place. It is the Lancaster House 1966 Constitution, which has been amended over the years, and until the Christopher Blackman's the Commission reports and the recommendations are accepted, the Constitution which we presently have remains in place. I want to begin by saying, in concluding remarks here tonight, that it has been for me a great pleasure to be here at Foundation as the Parliamentary Reform Chairman of its commission. Sir Roy Chortman, a Deputy Chairman, and I spent many years in the old Foundation School, which is just below the parish church. In my case, I was there for 3 years before, in 1956, we moved to the new school. This is the new school, which was opened in 1956. And we are happy to be here tonight because, for us, it holds many pleasant memories. For most fellow Barbadians, they engage with national politics every 5 years or whatever lesser period there is from election to election. Other than that, there is no regular interaction between the citizen and Parliament. And so this Parliamentary Reform Commission provides a rare opportunity for Barbadians to have their say on their Parliament, its functions, operations, and structure. So far, Barbadians have been taking up the challenge and responding heartily. So I want to begin by thanking the public for its positive and supportive response which the Commission has received thus far. This response has been made possible by the print and electronics media in broadcasting the work of the Commission. I want to thank them and urge them to maintain their supportive role. We need it for sure, and there's no doubt about that. The Commission has a number of public sessions that will be happening in a short time frame, and we want to ask the public to stay tuned and stay engaged. In fact, our next meeting, next Thursday at about the same time, 7 o'clock or thereabout, will take place at Princess Margaret School near 6 Roads, next Thursday night, the 31st of August. And there we will be discussing the role and responsibility of parliamentarians as well as their terms of service. I'm told that that is a hot topic on the call-in programs, and that there are many distortions and pieces of misinformation which must be corrected and put right. And on that occasion, we hope to do that and more. So it would be a good opportunity for Barbadians to learn more about what their members of Parliament do on a daily basis. Some say that they only see their MPs at election time. And they often ask questions when election comes around. What has he or she, the MP, seeking re-election, what has been done for the last 4 or 5 years, as the case may be. From my own experience, I can only tell you that the job of the MP, for those who are interested and energetic, is a very demanding one indeed. I often tell the story of a large number of artisans living in St. Joseph when I was the MP there. They would often be working in St. Peter or St. Lucie, and so they would have to get up, get themselves ready to catch the first bus going from St. Joseph to town. And I think that that was as early as 5:30. So that I am up ever since 4, preparing my work for the courts and also listening out for my early calls from the constituency. A fellow will come through, I pick up the phone at 10 minutes after 4 a.m. He said, "Oh, man, I know that as a country boy, you up early like me." And I says, "Man, tell me how I can help you." He then tells me that he's working in St. Lucie. So he has to catch the first bus to town, which leaves St. Joseph at 5:30, then catch the one from town to St. Lucie. And so he has to be up early. All he wants to tell me is that he wants to come to see me on Saturday, and he wants to have me top or near top of the list. because he knows that I may be seeing 30 or more people that Saturday, and he doesn't want to come and have to spend 2 or 3 hours. So that the notion that parliamentarians do little or nothing is really not true, and only those who are unfamiliar with the system make that sort of comment. And that emphasizes the significance of the meeting which we are holding next week at Princess Margaret School. And a fellow parliamentarian, now returned from competitive politics, and who served as deputy chairman of the Senate when I was chairman, Rudolph Cappy Greenwich, will be speaking on that particular theme and topic. What is the role and responsibility of the MP, the constituency MP? And he will give many practical illustrations of the demands that are made on them and the nature of their work. I can tell you that for those of us who are able, when we take on that responsibility, and who love people and politics, have found it a demanding role, but one which is incredibly rewarding. The idea that you have helped people with a large range of demands, and who felt, for example, that they could not access government departments and institutions. You sometimes have to be their spokesman and access the aid and the assistance that they need through the MP, whoever he is at the time. I just want to say, as I bring my remarks to a close, that the great step in our development since 1951. 1951 is important because it is the first time that John Public was allowed to cast his vote without having property or income qualifications. You just had to be a Barbadian who had reached a particular age. At that time it was 21, 1951, and you were free to cast your vote. And it would not have been possible because there was land and income qualifications for many years prior to that. Unless you had a certain amount of land or you earned income of a particular high amount, you were not allowed to vote. But those qualifications were removed in 1950 when the legislation establishing adult suffrage was passed in our parliament, and in the election following, 1951 general election, all those who were 21 years and older were allowed to cast their vote. I remember the day well. It was a happy day for a large number of Barbadians who had hitherto been deprived of the vote. And none of that would have been possible without the yeoman service of our parliamentarians, many of whom are no longer with us. I knew many of them who served in the 50s and subsequently. And I knew many of them too from my own service in Parliament and around Parliament. And they are now part of the living dead, as it were. But next week, at Princess Margaret, Rudolph Cappy Greenwich, former member of Parliament, of the House of Assembly, that is, for a constituency in Philip, and subsequently deputy chairman of the Senate when I was the chairman. He was deputy president, of the Senate when I was president, will address us fully on the topic, the role and responsibility of the parliamentarian. And I look forward with great anticipation to what he has to tell us. I want to thank two of our commissioners who spoke tonight, Sir Roy Trotman, Senator Liz Thompson, and Dr. Chandler, all sitting at the head table and who were able to respond to questions and themselves pose many provocative questions along the way. I do not want to trespass on your time any further. I want to thank you for your attendance and your participation, and I join you in looking forward next Thursday night to the meeting at Princess Margaret School, secondary school, and I hope that we can look forward to seeing you there. So get home safely, and I hope to see many of you next week at the Princess Margaret School. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. And next week at the Princess Margaret Secondary School, as Sir Richard said, we will be hearing from Mr. Rudolph Greenidge, Cappy Greenidge, and also Mr. Stephen Lashley, former parliamentarian and Minister of Parliament, Democratic Labour Party. Also, as relates to parliamentary pensions, look forward, we are looking to have someone there next week at the Princess Margaret School to discuss parliamentary pensions. As it relates to the question concerning cabinet, just please permit me to read from the Constitution of Barbados, Section 64, subsection 1 and 2, says there shall be a cabinet for Barbados, which shall consist of the Prime Minister and not less than 5 other ministers, appointed in accordance with the provisions of Section 65. The cabinet shall be the principal instrument of policy and shall be charged with the general direction and control of the government of Barbados, and shall be collectively responsible therefore to Parliament. And that is the definition and role of the cabinet as prescribed by our Constitution. I just want to lend my thanks to that of Sir Richard. I want to thank the members of the Barbados Police Service who are here with us and who would have made sure that we were safe in these environs. And I want to thank especially the Board of Management, Principal, Deputy Principal, and the other members of the board of the Foundation School. We thank you for allowing us to be here. And all those who would have ensured, the persons who would have facilitated the live stream tonight, we thank you. And we look forward to next week at Princess Margaret Secondary School. Also, as it relates to the sign language interpreter, we thank you for your presence here and for the work, tireless work that you have done for us tonight. We're grateful to all of you. And it's just left for me to say one thing, and it's for you to have a wonderful night and to get home safely. Thank you.
I think we have